Well, good morning,
Hi,
everybody. Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Uh, Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us, folks on Zoom and folks on Facebook and YouTube. Uh, as some of our regulars are here, still trickling in. Thanks for making time again this week for what I hope will be a really wonderful conversation for several different reasons. We're joined this morning by none other than Steve Matloff, who, in addition to being a longtime Temple member and his family being among the pioneers in our schools at the Glazer campus, in addition to his Temple connection, Steve sits on the board of a remarkable organization called NECHAMA, Jewish Response to Disaster, which, in full disclosure, I also sit on the board of. And NECHAMA is the only Jewish disaster response organization in the country, I guess is the easiest way to say it. And is an organization that I became aware of about 8 years ago, I think, 7 years ago, in the wake of Superstorm Sandy. So this whole area and space of natural disasters that I think so many of us, particularly in the last week or two, maybe are thinking even more about as wildfires, rage up and down the West Coast. We had an earthquake 2 days ago. Hurricanes in the Gulf. Certainly, Mother Nature does not care that we're in the midst of a pandemic as natural disasters continue to afflict folks all over the globe. So it's a space and a topic that I've been interested in for a really long time. And one of the first things I ever got to do at the Temple was to travel to Haiti in the wake of the earthquake there. Now about 10 years ago, more than that, actually, 12 years ago, I think, because we had organized a project that some may remember to provide water filtration systems and to provide clean water to folks in Haiti after that. And I was a rabbinical intern at the time at the Temple, and I guess like drew the short straw or through the luck of the draw, got to go down to Haiti with one of our then trustees, Andy Haas, and basically deliver the money and make sure that we were actually getting, what we were paying for. And we spent 3 days down there distributing these water filtration systems in these refugee camps where folks were living. And it was an amazing experience. And on the flight home, Andy and I got into this conversation about the fact that we thought that, in the wake of a disaster, there are definitely people who just want to write a check and do something to help, and that is necessary. He said, but there's also people who want to go and actually do something tangible to help clean up, to help people know that folks care about them, to distribute aid, whatever it is, people who actually want to, lace up the boots and put their feet on the ground. And then, like a lot of good ideas that I have, I did absolutely nothing with it for a couple of years. And in the wake of Superstorm Sandy in New York, Corey Wenter, our director of safety and security at the Temple, who many know, spent a few weeks there working with Team Rubicon, which at the time was solely about mobilizing vets and using their incredible skills and talent in the beginning early days after disaster. And Corey came back and said, it's unbelievably awful there. There's so much that needs to be done. We should try to get a group from the Temple to go and do something and help. And I said, yeah, I had an idea about like that years ago and never did anything about it. And we started, seeing if we could muster up a group of folks who wanted to actually go and help clean up and help people put their homes and their lives back together. We managed to rally a small but mighty group of volunteers who were willing to come with us. And we discovered this organization called NECHAMA, who was on the ground in New York, mobilizing volunteers, and they happened to be a Jewish organization. And that's all we knew about them. And over the last 6-7 years, we've really built this program at the Temple called our Disaster Response Team, which has mobilized, I should know, 7 times, I think. in the wake of disasters, 6 of those 7 times working with NECHAMA to really, like as I said, help people clean up their homes, or rebuild their homes, and rebuild their lives. And it's been an amazing experience personally for me. It's been an amazing experience professionally for me. And as I said earlier, it's led me to try to help NECHAMA in a more leadership role. And it's a space that I think people don't even know exists. This space of disaster response. People know about the Red Cross, and for many, that's kind of the beginning and the end of the story. So I invited Steve today to share a little bit about the work that NECHAMA does in general, the challenges that it faces, and also some of the ways in which the organization has pivoted and is doing a different kind of meaningful work in the wake of COVID. And also, I'll say a bit in the wake of some of the social unrest that we've seen in the last few months. NECHAMA is a Minneapolis-based organization, so the killing of George Floyd and the rioting and protesting that took place thereafter, hit very close to home for NECHAMA. So, Steve, thanks for being here and being patient through my long-winded kind of introduction. So, tell us a little bit about NECHAMA.
Yeah, I would love to. And let me actually ask a question too. Obviously, I see a couple of folks on Zoom. Are people able to submit questions? Obviously, people on Zoom are others who are consuming this. Are they able to, or not really?
I think so, Don.
Able to submit questions? Obviously, people on Zoom
people on Zoom.
Others who are consuming this. Are they able to, or not really?
And also on Facebook.
I think so. Okay. Yeah, they'll field those to us. They'll be a little delayed, most likely, but yeah.
That's great. And you know what? Let me do this too, just because this could actually be interesting, just using this format. If anyone just wants to email me directly with a question, feel free to do that too. I'm going to provide my email address right now, and I'll keep my email in front of me if anything just happens to come through. It is Stephen, STEPHEN, period, Matloff, MATLOFF. It's obviously also written, well, Steve Matloff's written on my Zoom placard here, but steven.matloff@gmail.com. Or if anyone wants to text me, I can pull that up to 323-963-3279. Again, 323-963-3279. I'll try to keep my eye on that. So Beau, first of all, thanks. Thanks for so much. First and foremost, thank you for bringing me into this work. I think for so many of us who are very community oriented and are very humanity oriented, it's sort of a dream to be able to, really put your body quite literally where your mouth and heart is, and to actually show up and to help people when they're in their moment of greatest need. And really, it's not something that I think that I would have probably sorted out on my own. Just sort of thinking, after a hurricane, after a tornado, after earthquakes, the best thing for me to do is just to stay away. And the reality is there are a lot of opportunities to come, and many small hands make big work. I think is a really important adage. I kind of butchered it there, but the idea that, it is our responsibility, not necessarily to finish the work, but to certainly pitch in, is one that I relate to very strongly. And I'm not sure that I necessarily would have known how to do that after big storms. And what you and Corey demonstrated to us and brought us into is that it actually is very possible. It's very much within the realm of possibility. And it's actually relatively easy to do. You need to show up. I mean, so much of life is literally about showing up, and to be able to sort of put things aside and prioritize showing up for. I actually just pulled up the list of sort of where we've been. So people in, New York after Sandy, or Lyons, Colorado after flooding there, or in Illinois after tornadoes, Mississippi after tornadoes, South Carolina, Louisiana, Texas after flooding and hurricanes and whatnot, to really show up is really an incredible thing. It's incredibly fulfilling. So let me tell you a little bit about what NECHAMA does, and sort of how they have been able to be our good partner and the partner to many other organizations. So NECHAMA was founded about 25 or 30 years ago by a couple of, well, it was really the brainchild of a single gentleman, but he sort of quickly recruited three of his friends. So sort of the four of them kind of kicked it off. There was a major storm in the Midwest. And when storms hit, oftentimes faith-based organizations will show up to provide assistance. And all of the assistance that is provided is necessary and is greatly appreciated. And this gentleman, was in touch with various coordinators of volunteer organizations and realized there was no Jewish organization that was representing us in these efforts. And he felt that that was a real travesty, that given, basic values of Judaism, so much of what guides us around tzedakah and around Tikkun Olam, and we weren't there, and that wasn't representative of who we are. And he sort of took it upon himself to change that. And he said, called three buddies who were Jewish and said, let's go, let's drive to Iowa, grab, your rakes and grab your shovels, and let's go and just do what we can. And that was really the birth of NECHAMA. After that, every time that there was a storm sort of within striking distance of Minneapolis, drive and get to, they would go and they would show up. And then, they had t-shirts, and then they had a name, and then there was a truck, and then the truck was filled with tools, and then there was a staff, and then, the staff would show up and would start to engage volunteers. So it wasn't just sort of the four original, friends showing up. It was actually a staff with volunteers. The model today is sort of an evolution of that. So we have a very small permanent staff that is on our books year round. And depending on the season and depending on the year and the situation, we ramp up, and we will bring in coordinators to be on our staff in certain areas where there is need. And then we engage volunteers. We bring volunteers from all over the country. Some of the volunteers are volunteers that know us well and have worked with us year in and year out and show up for 2 days or 2 weeks or a month, regardless of where and when something happens. It's a really incredible, committed group and a really extraordinary family. Volunteers also are people who hear about NECHAMA's efforts and show up once, one time only. I will say that most people who show up and actually do the work tend to get the bug. It's incredibly so I think people who literally show up once are probably few and far between. But there are people who just show up as individuals. There are also people that show up as groups. So actually our temple, Wilshire Boulevard Temple, is a perfect example of that. We showed up as a disaster response team. That first group that Beau is referring to was 7 of us total, including Beau and Corey. And that group over time, I'd say we probably have sort of 18 to 20 kind of unique individuals who've shown up for different deployments. Certainly that original group, well, obviously Beau and Corey, and then that originally group of 5 have been very committed to showing up. And over time, we've had an additional dozen or so people who have joined us on various deployments, which has been incredible.
Steve, I want to interrupt for a second talking about volunteer engagement. Is it fair to say that the majority of volunteers NECHAMA engages are not Jewish?
So it's it is mixed. One of our great guiding principles within Judaism, obviously, is that we don't only help our own, that we help the stranger, that we help our neighbors. We really don't ask. We have a lot of volunteers that come who are Jewish. We have a lot of volunteers who come who are not Jewish. And interestingly, when you talk about, and actually let me skip to the client side, so to speak, the people whose homes we actually help. They're very rarely Jewish. It is the case that we will show up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and the synagogue was flooded, or some of the congregants of the local synagogues' homes have been flooded, and we will help. But we quickly move on to the general population. And from an ambassadorship perspective, it's pretty extraordinary to have a group of people show up who represent, possibly when you're talking about rural South Carolina or rural Mississippi or rural or even urban, kind of anywhere, just fill in the blank, a group of Jews who show up with and just ready to work their tails off to help. And then after 3 days of, taking your home from just utter destruction and you having absolutely no idea how you're going to move on, to leaving 3 days later with a totally clean slate upon which they can build, and just shake your hands and thank you, for the opportunity. The group thanks the homeowners for the opportunity to be of service, and then just leave with no ask. It's an extraordinary act of ambassadorship for Judaism. I mean, people who maybe have never met a Jew before may have some preconceived notions of what Jews are. To have this, group sort of come in and to commit to them fully and to just walk away, no questions asked. It's
Well, and Steve, can you, with all appropriate respect to our non-Jewish brothers and sisters, can you contrast that with much of the other providers in the space?
So anecdotally, I can, because I hear it a lot, as do a lot of us who end up in the field. That I sort of mentioned earlier that there are a lot of faith-based organizations that tend to show up after big disasters like this. Anecdotally, what we hear is that a lot of those organizations see it as an opportunity to enlist. So we hear of situations where certain faith-based organizations will only help those who've been affected who are within their own faith, or homeowners who are willing to declare a commitment to something specific, the Bible, something else. We don't do that. A stranger is a stranger.
Right.
A neighbor is a neighbor. A fellow countrymate is a fellow countrymate. A fellow human is a fellow human. And we show up and we get to work, and we do the work that needs to be done, and then they're sort of set on their path. And people are deeply appreciative. I mean, it's interesting. Our staff now has been for a little while mostly non-Jewish. They are people who just relate so deeply to the very core values and ideals that guide our work. And when they sort of, it's really interesting, speaking with them and sort of sharing more about Judaism and a lot of these underlying values that drive us. And for them, it's an education into us and our long tradition. And that doesn't mean necessarily that we're Orthodox or conservative, that we are practicing daily. It just means that we're guided by certain values, and it's really extraordinary to see how others really relate to it strongly. And so actually right now 100% of our staff is not Jewish, interestingly, which often begs the question, like, well, if your staff is not Jewish, if your volunteers are interfaith, if almost none of the people you help are Jewish, what makes you a Jewish organization? And the simple answer is the values that drive us. They are Jewish. They are Jewish ideals. And I will say that I am a believer that we do not have a monopoly on goodness. There are others that do as well. But I happen to have been born Jewish, and I'm deeply proud of it. And it is, the value of my lineage. And I'm really incredibly excited and honestly quite grateful that I have the opportunity to express that in this way. A really interesting anecdote, and then I'll sort of get into some of maybe a little bit of detail into sort of what we do, what it means to actually show up on a deployment, what NECHAMA actually does, what we're doing right now in Louisiana. I'll tell a quick anecdote about my own family and their response to this. So after probably our second or third deployment, So let me see, we did, yeah, so it was January 2013 was New York. And then we did October 2013. We did May of 14. It was pretty consistent, sort of every year and a half, every year and a half. There was a really big storm that was reported, and it may have been the one in South Carolina in late 2015. And actually, my wife was driving with our kids from the temple home, and it came on to the news that there was this really awful storm that was hitting the East Coast. And the kids, our kids, said to my wife, "Is Daddy gonna go and help?" And to me, that is like the essence. That is the absolute essence of what inspires me in this work. That not only can we be thoughtful about our fellow humans and their state of affairs locally and what they're dealing with, but that not only can we show up for them, but actually that we expect ourselves to. That my kids literally said, "Is Daddy going to go and help?" And we did. We deployed and we went. And that our kids are growing up with that expectation baked into their development, honestly, is gold for me. It really is. You know, the idea that it's not enough. It is great to think well. It is really, really great to think well. But to be able to, you know, actually show up is a really extraordinary thing, and especially when it comes, you know, to a disaster. I'm not a trained EMT. I'm not a firefighter. I'm not. There are a lot of things I'm not. Right. I mean, I'm a you know, business school educated, you know, finance person. But to have the opportunity to actually show up is gold. It's unbelievable. So Beau, do you want me to talk a moment about, sorry, I get emotional every time I talk about it, especially with the kids. Do you want me to talk for a moment about sort of what it actually means to show up at NECHAMA?
What do we actually do?
Yeah, so and by the way, the NECHAMA website and social media is quite good. If any of you want to sort of see, you know, very regular pictures of the type of stuff that happens, you can log on to nechama.org, NECHAMA.org. By the way, NECHAMA is a Jewish name meaning comfort. And so we really focus on that our mission is to provide comfort and hope to people who are sort of comfortless and hopeless. You can also go on to predominantly Facebook. NECHAMA has a really great presence where there are a lot of ongoing stories that are posted on a regular basis. But I'll talk for a moment. Why don't I do this? Why don't I talk for a moment about what we're doing now? Because this is sort of traditional to what we do. And then I'll kind of back up to, you know, 6 months ago when COVID hit. You know, Hurricane Laura hit Louisiana, I think on the 26th or 27th of August. And it was the strongest storm recorded in 163 years, some unbelievable statistic like that. And it really wreaked havoc to Louisiana, particularly, especially the sort of the western portion of Louisiana near the Texas border. And our team showed up 5 days later, and we drive most places because we bring a vehicle or a couple of vehicles, and we bring equipment. That's sort of part of the story of what it means to show up in NECHAMA. And so our team showed up. It was 2 operations people who showed up in Louisiana on the 1st of September and engaged in what they call an assessment. So first and foremost, you show up, you see who else has shown up, because, you know, there are a lot of volunteer organizations that may or may not show up. I will say that just sort of given the current state of affairs in the world and COVID and whatnot, many organizations who normally would show up have not shown up. We have committed to continue showing up sort of no matter what. They showed up in Louisiana, and they sort of got a lay of the land with regard to what other organizations were there, what other organizations sort of specialties and skills are. And then, you know, meeting with local residents, including people from the Jewish community. We always make it a point to connect with local synagogues and with rabbis to kind of find out, you know, what happened, where it happened, where people are seeing, you know, certain types of damage. And we sort of start to hone in and continue that assessment. During that assessment, we will start to do work as well, but we will sort of move ourselves closer and closer to, where help is needed. And it's not always the epicenter. The epicenter of disaster is often the place that is, flooded, forgive the term, by relief efforts. And it's often, the periphery that is forgotten. So there are many, many times when we will, head straight into, the nucleus of what was hit, and then we'll actually end up, somewhere on the fringes because no one else is there. So we ended up in Louisiana. The actual work during the assessment period was very obvious that there needed to be a lot of debris removal. So predominantly trees that had fallen, some on structures, but a lot just on roadways, making roadways impassable, making, yards, a total mess. And so our group, while meeting with rabbis and homeowners and everything else, pulled out the chainsaws and started cutting up trees, massive trees. And again, if you go to NECHAMA.org or if you go onto social media, you'll actually see a number of pictures of the team engaged in chainsaw work and debris removal. We are still doing that. We've been there, now 3 weeks. We are still doing debris removal. After sort of 10 to 14 days, the assessment period comes to an end. And we've identified who needs help and where they need help. We did our assessments predominantly in Lafayette, Louisiana, and Lake Charles, Louisiana, and we settled in Lake Charles. So we have been in Lake Charles working alongside some other volunteer organizations, in some cases just working on our own, and importantly, oftentimes working alongside homeowners themselves, doing debris removal outside their homes, just removing trees, making roadways passable, usually stacking everything by the side of the road so that debris removal crews, trash removal crews can get to work doing that. Usually there's a state funds that are committed to just, removal of waste. And we are still doing that work. And that work will continue until everything is cleared. There's a really endearing story, again, on the website. I actually posted it myself to Facebook the other day because I was really moved about it, about a woman who lived next door to one of the homes that we were helping. And she and her 2 young sons, youngish, sort of teen sons, were removing debris. And I believe, if I remember correctly, she had moved to the area from Cuba, within the last decade or so. And, our team went over and helped her remove, the debris, certainly having, a group of like 6 or 8, as opposed to just, a mother with her 2 teenage kids. It moved along much more quickly. And she actually said, if you need help, with any debris removal, with any of my, neighbors' homes, please come and get us. And we would love to help. And that is, the beauty of this work is people, pitching in together. So we are still involved with that work with debris removal. There is another storm that's coming through the area right now. I don't know how many people are sort of watching the South Atlantic's weather patterns, but there's a tropical storm Beta that's coming through. So our team is actually retreated to Baton Rouge to wait out that storm. And once that storm is hit, we will be heading back to Lake Charles to continue debris removal. And then the next piece after debris removal, which is really outdoors, is to go inside of homes. So whenever there's a water event like flooding or hurricanes, there is definitely damage that comes from high winds, but the real damage comes from water. And high winds, in a hurricane, the damage can often be very broad, but like in tornadoes, wind damage can affect, a series of homes on one side of the street and not touch the other side of the street at all. Or it can literally go between 2 houses. Mm-hmm. Houses are untouched and the one in the middle is totally destroyed.
Right.
With water events, everybody. Yeah. Water obviously, levels off and everyone is affected. So we will now go inside of homes, with the homeowners' obviously approval and oftentimes with them. And we will first start to identify just what is not salvageable. And we will do removal of, personal possessions, of furniture, of, refrigerators. I mean, it's, appliances, anything that is not salvageable gets removed from the home, taken to the curb. Then we start removing, flooring materials, carpets that have been, destroyed. we start to remove walls. Oftentimes, especially in places like the Southeast where they have, humid conditions, they'll start to see the onset of mold, right? And so you want to try to stop that as quickly as you can. We stop it by removing the drywall or the material, whatever the wall material may be, we remove it. We usually remove it to a certain height, as the water usually is, a foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet. And so we'll remove maybe the drywall up to 4 feet or up to 6 feet. Sometimes we remove all the drywall, but we'll remove all of that. Oftentimes, when you talk about removing drywall, as some of you may know, when you put drywall up, usually you use drywall screws. You may use like nails. All of those come out. Everything comes out so that you're left with studs that are bare and clean. Oftentimes, we'll actually do sort of the initial cleaning of the studs, like spraying with disinfectants or anti-mold, solutions. And then we start in with the floors. So all the floors may come up. Obviously, the assessments tell us what comes up, what doesn't come up, assessments of individual homes. But a floor, entire flooring materials may come up because they've been damaged. In certain circumstances, like when we were in Colorado, we had the flooding that actually raised rivers, and the rivers brought mud into the substructures of homes. So we, then get into the substructures of the homes and we start digging out, mud. And we literally won't finish. And we being the collective we, because we as a team, let's say that Wilshire Boulevard Temple disaster response team shows up and partners with NECHAMA, we may be there for 3 days or 4 days. And, we do our work until we need to leave, and then another team will come in and continue the work, and we've continued the work of someone else. NECHAMA won't leave until that home is ready for rebuilding. The work that we do is very valuable. It's a lot of human capital that goes into it. Unfortunately, there are some very good actors after these storms. There are also less good actors, and given that insurance is sometimes responsible for paying for this, although a lot of clients that we help oftentimes don't have insurance, which is a whole nother set of circumstances and makes our work, that much more important. But we've seen people, we've done work over 2 days where people have gotten quotes for $50,000 for debris removal, and a team of, 8 of us will go in there, remove everything, get it to the curb, for nothing. There's not a single dime that they need to expend. And they're ready to start rebuilding, which, by the way, is a whole nother task, right? I don't want to say that just because we've removed everything that's damaged and non-salvageable that they're ready to move on. I mean, they still have a long road ahead of them, but they can actually see a path at that point. Before we get there, some of these homes are really, I would not know. I myself would not know how to proceed. So that's what we do. We'll also engage in sort of what they call Tarp work. So to the extent that, a storm comes through and does damage to a roof, unfortunately, as Beau sort of noted at the beginning, Mother Nature doesn't stop. So, we had Laura come through, we have Beta coming through now. You try to stop as much as you can. So there'll be Tarp work that will be done. Let me back up to, March. In March, we were in Nashville after a series of hurricanes hit Nashville. By we, I mean NECHAMA was there with volunteers. And the CDC came through and said, you guys have to stop operating. COVID, is a critical thing. We now have regulations around this. You can't have volunteers and you need to go home. And so we did. We packed up and headed back to Minneapolis. And which is heartbreaking because you know that there's more need on the ground, where you are. But we were faced with this, huge issue. So much of our model is based upon showing up for people. Our finances like really ebb and flow based upon, what's happening. Like, Hurricane Harvey hit Texas and, tons of funds came in from donors, individual donors, from, institutional donors, from states, grants from the government. I mean, money, flows in to allow you to do the work. But then it doesn't necessarily just come in just to maintain yourself. And with the prospects of having, been sent home and not being able to respond and, having to socially distance and not being able to work, shoulder to shoulder with people, we sort of, all scratched our heads and said, and by all, I mean, yes, all NECHAMA board members, but anyone in the volunteer response space, scratch our heads and said, how are we going to do this? Quite a few organizations shut down, hopefully temporarily. They sort of went on hiatus. They kind of mothballed everything and said, we're done responding. We can't do this. We refused to do that. We, feel very strongly that we continue to have a disaster. It's just very different than the one that we're used to dealing with. And so we knew that we couldn't engage, especially March, April, May. We could not engage volunteers in the traditional sense, but we would still be responsive. And so as a disaster response organization, we have a lot of equipment and supplies, a lot of PPE. And so we took everything that we had in our warehouse and we distributed it. We just sent it. Well, we didn't send it. We literally put it in one of our vehicles and took it to local hospitals in Minneapolis, to elder care facilities, assisted living communities that were in desperate need of PPE at a time when PPE was not available. And we just gave it out. We handed it out to first responders, to those in need, and to others. Then we started dealing with issues with people being stuck at home and being afraid to go out. I mean, certainly I was afraid to go out, and I'm, a healthy, person, just over my prime, maybe well beyond my prime. But, a lot of people, for very good reason, did not want to leave home. And so we had a lot of people who were at home with no resources. And so we connected with local food banks and other food providers and said, we have some people and we have some vehicles. What can we do? And they said, well, can you help with food distribution? Absolutely. So we started distributing food, started distributing some medicines. We started distributing not only within sort of the city limits of Minneapolis and St. Paul. We started expanding, throughout Minnesota. We started going to some Indian reservations that were in desperate need of certain supplies. We started delivering, blankets, really anything we could do to be responsive to COVID. I will say during that time, so people started to come out to help and sort of volunteering, with masks and start developing some protocols was possible, but it was really kind of a very, bare bones group. Then there were those two dams in Michigan, in Midland, Michigan, that broke. And we had been in Midland, Michigan several years ago. And there, it's a community that we have helped historically. And we said, we cannot not show up for these people. So our operations team deployed. We did not engage, we did engage volunteers, but only local volunteers. So part of what we do often is to provide a housing option and food options for people. It's usually very sparse, sort of like bunker style and, very simple provisions. We have not been providing that because, we really can't offer housing to people, that's distant. So we engaged local volunteers to help in Midland. Then the riots broke out in Minneapolis after the George Floyd murder. And we said, how can we be productive here? There was a lot of burning and looting and destruction of stores. The team returned to Minneapolis and started engaging again in equipment deployment. So for instance, there were a lot of displaced persons encampments in city parks and whatnot, people whose homes had been damaged in and around the area of the rioting and whatnot. We took our shower trailer that we often use on deployments and installed it there. And then we started helping with cleanup. Then there was, and again, we started having more volunteers. Then there was more flooding in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. We deployed to Cedar Rapids and we're assisting there, and then came home just in time to redeploy to Louisiana, which brings us up, to where we are today. So Beau, I'm looking at time. I don't know exactly how long you do, but why don't I stop there? And if you have any thoughts of things to address or Laura, Merle, I can see, Don, maybe you've received messages. I have not received anything from anyone, but if anyone has any questions, or Beau, if you want to guide some Q&A of some sort.
Yeah, first, thank you, Steve. You are, I think, by far the most eloquent spokesperson that the organization has, and that was demonstrated all of us today. So thank you. The piece that I'll just add, which to kind of put a bow around it, because it's where you started, Steve, I think, in terms of the value of just showing up, because every now and then I get a question in terms of the Temples program and folks at their own expense traveling, usually buying a last minute plane ticket and lodging and all of that, which is not inexpensive. And sometimes folks will say to me, well, Rabbi, you had 8 people there, what have you, and at considerable expense, don't you think that the, all in $10,000, $15,000, whatever, people have spent cumulatively would do more good, versus the kind of the footprint of 5 or 6 of you being there. And that might be true, from an empirical sense in terms of, the actual work that's being done, but it negates the human benefit of showing up that Steve mentioned. So on every single trip that I've been on, I and others have had some version of the following conversation, right? Oh, where are you guys from? Oh, we're from California. Oh, wow. What brings you here? This. No, you're doing this while you're here, while you're in town. But what are you doing in Baton Rouge? This. You mean you came all the way from California to do this, to help us? Like, we thought nobody cared about us, or we thought everybody had forgotten about us, right? Because what is so often the case is, a big storm, no matter how big the storm is, a big storm comes through, and at best, 2 days later, 3 days later, maybe a week later, Al Roker goes home, and it's not on the evening, it's not on the morning news, and people forget about it. It's over. I mean, I remember when we responded to Sandy, we were in the Rockaways, and I had dinner one night in Manhattan with a friend of mine, and she said, "So, what are you guys doing here?" And I said, "Oh, we're doing cleanup." She said, "Oh, it's still bad out there?" And you're 4 miles away. There's still not power there, and people don't know. So every place we've been, I think, in some ways, more. I won't say more important, but just as important, at least, as the work is taking folks who feel like they've been forgotten about and that they're kind of just on their own now, and showing them that no, people do care and people are here for you. And it just, as a personal anecdote, it's certainly one of the most meaningful results from my perspective, and I know probably for Steve and for others. So we could both talk about NECHAMA all day, but
actually, there's one thing I'd love to share too, and it's also a little bit of a call to action. But this morning I sent out an email to a rabbi and an administrator of a congregation in Baton Rouge. They're actually a congregation that supported us 4 years ago when we were in Louisiana doing cleanup, and in fact, Beau and Corey and I and the crew were in Baton Rouge with NECHAMA at that time. And I'm sending this on behalf of NECHAMA, but because it's a congregation, I say to them, we're most in need of funds and volunteers. The way that we're able to offer our services free of charge is that, people write checks and people show up with us. And so I'm trying to give them an idea of or trying to lead them down a pathway for how to think about their own congregation and the fact that these are neighbors of theirs. And so I wrote to them, the two of them, the rabbi and the administration, both women. Our Wilshire Boulevard Temple disaster response team has deployed with NECHAMA on many occasions since then. So I have experienced firsthand how our congregation can band together and work with NECHAMA to provide comfort and hope to strangers. It is a powerful experience that brought me and those on our team closer to each other, to our congregation, and to our Jewish identities. And I think that, that in general is first and foremost, the work we do is important to others. It is of critical importance, but it actually also is, of critical importance to us. And showing up in that way really does, not only affect the way that we look at ourselves, but it affects the way that we look at ourselves as Jews. And so to the extent that any of you, we as a community are lucky to have Beau and Corey and the commitment of Rabbi Leader and many others. We have that, in our community. But I think all of us would love, and especially one of the reasons that a couple of us have joined the board of NECHAMA, is we would love to be an example to other communities that they can show up to, and that they can even come to work with us from time to time, and then to develop their own efforts in their own, in their own temple communities. And so if any of you have family or friends, in LA, in the Bay Area, on the East Coast, in the middle of the country, wherever it may be, who are, devoted members of their communities, of their Jewish communities, really of any communities, I mean, even school communities, but, especially their Jewish communities, please share this story with them, and have them get in touch with Beau or with me, because we would love to bring others, into this work. It's deeply meaningful to those we help. And quite honestly, it's deeply meaningful to us. It really. So Beau, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Steve. Any questions, thoughts, comments? We do have a question from Don, actually. Oh, sorry, an online question. And then Merle, I'll get to you. The question is, as a reflection of the Jewish people, what has been the reaction, especially of non-Jewish communities, I guess, to us?
Yeah, so, I think the anecdote that Beau just shared is a pretty strong one and fairly universal. People, both surprised and incredibly grateful that we are there for them, very specifically for them. And again, this is both from the context of NECHAMA and from the context of our own efforts within our congregation. People just really, really deeply grateful, and it affects the way that they look at Jews. It really does. We live here in Los Angeles, which is one of the largest Jewish populations in the world. A lot of very prominent Jews in a lot of different areas. Obviously, our community, its extraordinary side, like this ecosystem of Judaism does not exist in a lot of places, and especially in a lot of places that get hit really, really hard by natural disasters. And so to be sort of the representation of what Jews are, and to be a really extraordinary representation of that is, I think, critical for ambassadorship. And it's not something that's lost on us. It really isn't. I think that, given sort of the number of us that actually exist in the world, and, unfortunately, the amount of hate that's out there that is spewed in a lot of different directions, including squarely to ours, being good ambassadors is really critical. And so it's meaningful. I mean, I think the simple answer is it's very meaningful to non-Jews to see a group of Jews show up, ready and willing to help.
Merle, you were threatening to raise your hand, I think, before
I raised it. I've never heard of this before, and I just find this work absolutely phenomenal. Being somewhat physically challenged, I don't know that I could get on a plane and go somewhere, and I'm not worried about the hotel issue, but being challenged in some ways, I can't get into ripping apart and stuff like that. But living in Arizona, if there were anything, ever something like the food distribution or, stuff like that, I'd do it in a minute. Because this is just, I can walk, but I need, I can't stand for a long time.
To your first point, and Steve's probably tired of hearing me say this, I say frequently at our board meetings that, for better or worse, NECHAMA has a monopoly, right? And the fact that, and this is starting to change, but the fact that you are not alone, Merle, and you are an informed, engaged, plugged in Jew in the broader Jewish world. The fact that most of my colleagues have never heard of NECHAMA is I think is the challenge, because no one else is doing it. And I think in a very Rabbi Leader and I were talking about this in February after I was in Minneapolis for a meeting, and I said, yeah, people just don't know. He said it's very Midwestern. Sort of, we do our work and we kind of keep our head down and we don't grandstand about it.
It is true.
Right. And I understand that, and that makes sense. And that until very recently, NECHAMA was very, I would say, Midwest centric, not necessarily in terms of response, although there now have been responses in California, which there had not been, but in terms of its leadership and in terms of just its way of thinking about itself. And so I think that, from my perspective, the next big challenge, which is a great one, is how do we put NECHAMA on people's radars, so that it's not the best kept secret in the Jewish world.
Come visit. Come visit and talk to our congregational boards. I mean, that's what needs to be, or somehow in the communities, that's what needs to be. I mean,
right. Unfortunately, it's usually communities that find out about us, when they need us badly.
The wrong way.
Right.
I mean, what I'm thinking is all these fires and all these floods, and the floods that happened after the fires, and there's a lot of people out there that could do things, and could be, and I think that in a lot of cases, this is my social work background speaking, I think that this would give people a lot more, they would feel better about their Judaism, that this is where it's coming from. So, I don't know, but this is something that if there were to be something that happened on this side of the country and it would be something I could physically do, I would be there in a minute.
I'm going to hold you to that.
Yeah,
Don't worry about it. I mean, there's stuff I can do. I just have to, it's the walking and the standing issue, but there's more to this than just ripping apart a flooded home. I mean, being in Houston, where my cousin is in a nursing home, and seeing what went on there after the floods, and where the nursing home is across the street from the levee, and seeing what had to be done in the nursing home. I mean, and I know with COVID, it's a huge challenge to do anything right now, but I really do believe that this is something that somehow we can, if more of us showed our visibility and stuff like this, then I think it would encourage others.
It's
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I would say, first of all, definitely don't sell yourself short. Maybe you don't want to go in, immediately after a hurricane, but if something is in your, neck of the woods, do not sell yourself short. We have very, very committed volunteers, who show up every single time, who are in their upper 70s and early 80s. And, are they moving as quickly as some of the younger folks? Well, no, neither am I. I'm 47, and there are people who are moving much quicker than me, but they are incredibly important members of the community. But the second thing that you said, I think, is a critical one, which is that this is an ecosystem, for Jews, quite honestly.
Exactly.
We show up, and NECHAMA may be, I think that NECHAMA is, Beau said it best, unfortunately, we have a monopoly. We are, the worst kept secret, or maybe it's the best kept. Maybe it's the best kept secret that we don't want to have be a secret within the world. But we need as many ambassadors and as many mouthpieces as possible. And, if there are people within your community who you think would have interest, especially now, especially 6 months into COVID, where this is actually a very acceptable and maybe not perfect. I'd rather shake someone's hand and give them a hug. But this is actually a very, very productive method of communication. I would come and meet at any moment with anyone in and around your area who may have an interest in learning more and considering, how to be part of the ecosystem of support, whether that's showing up, whether that's providing funding on a regular basis, whether that's, having bar bat mitzvah, focused efforts on this. I will tell you about one situation that was really pretty extraordinary. We heard from a congregation in Boise, Idaho, called Congregation Ahavath Beth Israel. And we heard from their 7th grade students who have a program called the Budding Philanthropist Foundation. And they wanted us to be one of their 3 recipients of their annual fundraising for this Budding Philanthropist Foundation effort. And they wrote us a check for $1,000. We showed up at their annual meeting back in June via Zoom. We shared more about what we did. And it's growing the ecosystem, making sure that this, well-kept secret is not a well-kept secret. No one wants to keep this secret, so absolutely don't sell yourself short on showing up. That can definitely happen. But as a mouthpiece, you're aware of it. If this, inspires you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it broadly, and just know that at any time you can certainly get me to connect with anyone, and Beau can, help facilitate that at any time. So
Beau knows. I mean, I belong to Wilshire, but I live in Phoenix. But Beau knows one of the directors at camp, Andrea Cohen, is the director of the Community Youth Foundation through Federation. And this would be something I think that's amazing for the kids to create. And it's mostly, I don't know the age level that's involved. I know it goes through high school, but I think it starts probably pre-bar bat mitzvah or in that age range. I think this is something that would be fabulous for her to know about. So I have to find her email
Good
address.
idea, though. Thank you.
Beau, you probably have her email address from Temple or camp or something, but I'll get a hold of it and send it to you, Steve, so that you can just tell her that I told her to contact you. I think our rabbi would be really interested too. So it's just one more thing for people who are mentally, physically, but are looking for something to do. And I think this is amazing.
Lori, your hands have been patiently up.
Well, yeah, I did. Oh, let me unmute you. Good. What you were saying, growing up in the Midwest, I understand about keeping this secret. It's people they don't want a lot of, to call attention to themselves and get a lot of thank yous. They just do what needs to be done, and then they go on with the rest of their lives. I think that's really true. But I think this whole organization squares with everything that we're doing at Karsh so directly, that just because the recipient isn't Jewish doesn't make this not a Jewish thing.
Right.
And I think it's, I'm with you, Merle. I can't do a lot physically either, but I have a big mouth, so I can tell a lot of people.
That works.
Well, Steve, thank you.
Thank you very much, because this is just, I will find those email addresses and send them to you, Steve, and let you communicate with them. And you can use my name that I mentioned from this subject. But I just think that there's a lot more right here in Arizona. I mean, there's always issues, and especially with the kids, they can get on a van and go do something. COVID is limiting, and people here are paranoid, but I think that eventually that's
forever
gone or easier to do.
Yeah, and even during this time, we've created certain protocols, and outdoor work is certainly very safe, and we naturally wear protective equipment as a part of the work anyway. Right. So I think when this first struck, everyone. I mean, I told you, a bunch of people just shut down, and we refused to do that. And I think it is very. I mean, Mother Nature's not going to stop, and I think that it is very, very possible to respond safely. So the show has to go on. It just has to. There's no option.
Great.
Well said, Steve. Well, thank you, everybody. Quick plug for next week. We'll be here next week talking about mental health issues again, and specifically maternal mental health with Gabrielle Kaufman, who is the clinical director of an organization called Maternal Mental Health Now, one of our collaborators at Karsh, and doing really, really amazing work. So it should be a wonderful, wonderful conversation next week. So hopefully folks will join us, and happy Tuesday, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good
Everyone.
Thank you.